Good afternoon. I'm Jim Kelly, Chairman of the Advisory Board at Fordham's Gabelli Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our partners, the Museum of American Finance and the CFA Society of New York. Our goal is to bring you renowned experts from many different fields to speak on topics and issues that are relevant to the economy, the markets, and to you. Today's webinar features Professor Doan Farmer discussing his new book, Making Sense of Chaos, A Better Economics for a Better World. He's in a fireside chat with Paul Johnson, Executive Director of the Gabelli Center. After their discussion, David Cowan, President of the Museum of American Finance, will join them for Q&A. Please submit your questions at any time through the tab at the bottom of your screen. Attendees at today's event will be offered a free digital copy of the book with information coming to you after the event. Now I'd like to turn it over to Paul Johnson, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that. As Jim said, our speaker today is Jay Doan Farmer. I usually like very short introductions because I'd rather get into it, but Doan has one of the greatest descriptions of his career that I've ever read, and I want to indulge the audience because I'm going to read this. Doan Farmer is an American complex systems scientist and entrepreneur who pioneered many of the fields that define the scientific agenda of our times: chaos, complex systems, artificial life, wearable computing, and more. He is the director of the Complexity Economics Program at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. He is also the Baillie Gifford Professor of Complex System Science at the University of Oxford. He's chief scientist at Macrocosm and an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. In addition, Doan is the author of a critically acclaimed new book, Making Sense of Chaos, A Better Economics for a Better World. Welcome, Doan. I am delighted to speak with you today. I read that introduction because the topics that you've been interested your whole career are the most important topics in probably economics, social science, emergent behavior, and many of the other things that are the leading edges of scientific research, certainly social science research. So I wanted to read that to set it up. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to start by defining some of the terms we're going to use so people know what they are, because I think people hear these terms but not necessarily understand them. Let's start with chaos. What's chaos?
It's really two things. It's any model that has dynamics in it or in the real world. Chaos occurs when you have sensitive dependence on initial conditions, meaning that nearby states of the world lead to very different outcomes in the future, that nearby initial conditions diverge exponentially. And the second thing that chaos involves is endogenous motion, meaning motion that comes from within the system itself. So if you're sitting by the side of a stream, the rocks in the stream are fixed, the flow of the water to the stream is fixed, but in a mountain stream, the water can move on its own, and it's moving because it's chaotic. That is, the system is so sensitive to small differences that it spontaneously generates movement, and that prediction becomes very hard because states that could correspond to the same measurement actually lead to very different outcomes in the future.
And so if we delve into this for a moment, if we run an experiment and we start the experiment at time X and we get an output, and then we run the same experiment, it's a complex experiment, not a deterministic one, and we start it again, we actually don't start at the same initial conditions, right? It's almost impossible to start at the same initial conditions. And so the outcome will be different. But what makes chaos interesting, I think, is the outcome could be radically different. It's not like we're off a little bit in the initial conditions, the end result's off by a little bit, right? We're off by a little bit in the initial conditions, and the end could be very different. Is that fair?
That's right, but let me just make one small correction. This happens even in deterministic systems. That's what makes it so amazing. Even under Newton's laws, where if you know the forces and you know the position and velocity, you can predict the future. Even under Newton's laws, nearby measurement or a measurement that has nearby states, you're going to get completely different outcomes.
All right, so even in these models that we think are kind of predictive, deterministic, we're going to have this thing. And I want to emphasize and make sure I got that right. It's the outcomes can be very different.
Very different. Yeah. Yeah. And so a good example is the weather. That's why you can't predict the weather more than a couple of weeks ahead, because essentially the same state of the world 2 weeks from now could lead to a very different future state of the world. There might be a hurricane or there might not, or the hurricane might go one direction or the opposite direction based on very small changes in the present state of the world.
And that's kind of the big insight of chaos. These systems, particularly if they have internal dynamics, as you said, they've become very unpredictable in a traditional sense of modeling them.
That's right.
All right, let's go to the next one. Complexity. What's complexity?
Complexity is systems that have emergent behavior. And what we mean by that is that the behavior of the whole can be dramatically and qualitatively different than the behavior of the building blocks. So the classic example I like to use, just because it's so remarkable, is the brain. The brain's made up of roughly 80 billion neurons. Now, if you look at an individual neuron, it's just a little, well, it's a cell that you feed a signal into, an electrochemical signal, and another signal comes out. It processes that signal. So look at a neuron, you go, oh, okay, what can we do with this? But somehow you hook 80 billion of them together and you get the human brain, which does all kinds of remarkable things that you never would have guessed you could do by just hooking neurons together. And this is so amazing that it wasn't until the 20th century that the idea that thinking could come from that kind of explanation, nobody even thought that was possible. And now in my book, the relevant example is the economy, which happens, it's the emergent behavior of the actions of 8 billion people. We're all doing our own specialized activities, but working together, we can do things that are far beyond what any of us could ever do by ourselves.
So I just want to clarify, add to it. So we see this emergent behavior all over the place. It ends up, it's in lots of ant colonies, the brain, the economy, organizations, right? So that emergent behavior. How does complexity and chaos relate to each other?
Well, chaos is a simple example of emergent behavior of a certain type. Okay. Because in chaotic systems, it's often easy to write the equations down, but there's no simple solution. You can't just write a solution with a piece of paper. You have to literally do the calculations over and over again to go forward into the future. So for the weather, for example, we use state-of-the-art computers, and we really have to do an enormous amount of calculation to compute the future state of the weather. And one thing to add, I mean, chaos doesn't mean you can't predict anything. We're actually pretty good at predicting the weather a day ahead, or even 2 days ahead. But it's 2 weeks out that we can't do. So, and in fact, sometimes understanding that a system's chaotic can help you predict it better. And that's one of the points I'm making in the book.
All right, I want to come back to the weather for a second, because, you know, the old joke is that economic forecasts make weather prediction look good.
Yeah.
And the key is we've gotten much better at these models than the number of days out we can model them. But because the initial conditions, just slight changes can vary out as you get 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 out. It's just the range of possible outcomes is so great. I think that's the reason we can't predict with any kind of precision. We can predict with big ranges, but not with any precision. I think it's that.
Well, the weather is an extremely nonlinear system where small differences cause huge changes going forward. It's intrinsic to fluid flow that this is the case. And, you know, the famous equations, the Navier-Stokes equations, still nobody can get any closed form solutions. It's remarkable that something you can write down and, you know, one line can be so hard to actually properly understand.
All right, so we've got chaos where we have changes in small initial conditions can have very big different outcomes. We have complexity. The primary takeaway is emergent behavior from complexity. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Next on our list, adaptive agents.
Yeah, well, adaptive agents are, as the name suggests, agents that adapt to the conditions around them, like organisms, human beings in a society. And in fact, economics is a strong version of that because we're adapting not just genetically through time, but we're very programmable. Human beings can think things through. They can change their behavior based on the circumstances at the time. Makes us very hard to understand.
And our behavior can be nonlinear, which brings us, the economy can have parts that are chaotic because of that adaptive agent. Whereas before it was flows and things like that are interacting with each other. In this case, it's individuals that are changing their behavior through learning, through experience, through emotions, whatever it may be.
It can be through adaptive behavior or merely through our collective nonlinear behavior, which might not be adaptive because you can get chaotic behavior in mechanical systems. So even the mechanical parts of the economy can behave chaotically. And of course, it gets a lot worse when you have human beings that can be changing their minds and trying to think about what the other guys are doing and tailoring their behavior accordingly.
Now, I get to push back because you just said it can be worse. It could just be worse in terms of predicting.
Worse, yes. Worse in terms of predicting. That's right.
Not necessarily worse for humans.
No. It's a very good thing that we can think and change our behavior.
Exactly. All right. The last one in this vocabulary, because we're going to use these building blocks. We're going to build a complex discussion today. Complex adaptive systems, combine the two.
Well, so there are complex systems where the elementary building blocks are things like people that exhibit adaptive behavior. You know, in economics, in a sense, is a combination of accounting, which provides us with a set of rules for how money behaves and assets behave. With human decision making, we make choices that cause things to flow on and off of balance sheets. And so in economics, we have to, on one hand, deal with the mechanical aspect of accounting, and on the other hand, deal with the behavioral aspect of human beings. And that's why it's hard.
And that's why we're going to get there. I just want to build that. But that's why the traditional linear, not even necessarily linear economic models tend to break, because they can't take into account these other behaviors. The most important, and external shock.
Yeah. We'll probably get there in the discussion, but there's also a whole methodological approach to writing.
Okay, great. I just wanted to tie people together. We're using these building blocks. Sure. Now, I do want to spend a moment. We could spend a lot of time on this question. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to get to this topic? Why? Because you are a pioneer. And I had a chance to actually meet Doan last week, earlier this week, at some point, and I have been reading about him, and a lot of people have been reading about him for several decades. And so it's really a treat to be able to talk to you live. And watching that journey is fascinating to me. If you'd share a little bit of that with the audience, it'd be great.
Yeah, I have to say, I never would have predicted when I was a kid, or even when I was finishing my PhD, that I would ever be working in economics in the way I am now. I began my career doing physical cosmology. I dropped out of graduate school for a while to beat the game of roulette.
Put a pin in that. I want to come back to that one. Put a pin in that.
I'm happy to do so. That got me interested in the problem of prediction. And when I found out about chaotic dynamics, I was fascinated by it. I had the good luck to be in graduate school with three other remarkable students who we formed a little community and co-advised each other. We called ourselves the Dynamical Systems Collective. I then spent 10 years at Los Alamos, and where it was a kind of playground of nonlinear science, and started the complex systems group there and began to think about complex systems more broadly in earnest, but was still doing a lot of prediction, chaos-related work. Whenever I would give a talk about that, somebody would always say, well, have you tried applying this to the stock market? And so I finally decided, well, okay, let's do that. So knowing nothing about the stock market, we banded together with my childhood friend, Norman Packard. We formed a company called Prediction Company, and managed to show we could indeed beat the stock market. It wasn't easy, but we made mathematical algorithms that did that. We created one of the first fully automated trading systems. And then I went to the Santa Fe Institute for 12 years, where I sort of combined my complex systems background with what I'd learned about finance and economics. And then I spent the last 13 years at Oxford after I got the offer to go there and advise students and start a group.
Perfect. We're going to come back to this. I do want to go back to roulette for a moment because a fairly famous book was written by that experience. And I think it's an incredibly fun story. When you tell just a little bit about trying to beat the roulette systems in Las Vegas.
Sure. This journey got started again by my friend Norman Packard, who after spending a summer in Las Vegas counting blackjack, this was in my third year of graduate school. I had also spent the summer in Montana, first working for the Forest Service, but then I quit my Forest Service job and just started playing poker because I made a lot more money playing poker than I was making working for the Forest Service. And but Norman convinced me. He said, "Look, roulette is just a physical system. The paradox is casinos use it as a random number generator, and yet." When you think about it, it's a rolling ball on a beveled circular track with a counter rotating inner wheel. That's mechanical. Newton's laws apply. Furthermore, there's about 10 to 15 seconds between when the croupier releases the ball and when the croupier closes the bets, which gives it time to gather initial conditions and make a prediction. So we bought a roulette wheel. We understood the forces acting on the roulette ball and wheel. We built actually what turned out to be the first wearable computer, was even concealable. This was starting in 1977, and we used switches in our shoes that we operated with our big toes, and to time the ball and tell the computer what was going on. We got little vibrations in our stomach that told us what numbers to bet on. And so we successfully beat the house. Now, we didn't get very rich, I have to say, because a combination of having a low bankroll initially, having a lot of hardware problems, and being a bit cowardly because we'd heard well-substantiated evidence that people had gotten hauled into the back room and, beat up. So we were wary about that part of the deal. So, but we did do fairly well, and it was quite an adventure. A lot of fun, I must say.
I loved reading about it 20 years ago, whenever the book came out. I was like, I never predicted I'd get a chance to interview. All right, let's get now closer to the topic at hand, economics. You claim pretty aggressively that you have no formal training in economics, but I think what you mean is no kind of formal graduate school institutional training, but you are a well-versed macroeconomist. At least it seems to me that you're more focused macro than micro. And I'll talk a little bit about that journey because I think as I read the book is fantastic. Everybody should read this book. This book is great. I'm really struck by your challenge of the orthodoxy when it comes to macroeconomics, but in a very thoughtful and systematic way. You talk a little bit about where we ended the last story, how you started to get interested in economics and then how you, quote, self-educated, I guess, to where you are today.
Yeah. I've taken only one formal course in economics in my life. I took Econ 1 when I was at Stanford, and I was, I think, 18 years old. And I have to admit, I didn't believe a lot of what I was being taught, and thought, oh, I'm not going to do anything with this. But one of the things I learned as a scientist is the most interesting fields of science are the ones that are least understood. And what I saw during my time at Prediction Company and reading a lot of economics was that I just didn't agree with, I didn't think the ideas that underlay the models were the best ideas for getting good results and making good predictive models. And so back at the end of the 90s, I set on a quest to really introduce new ideas into economics, and that's what I've been doing since. So I'm self-taught. I've had the great luxury of having some very good friends who are really good economists and who I've been able to learn a lot of economics just by asking them questions, reading books, and so on.
You talk about in the book a specific event or conference that you went to. I think it was a week long, and it was with some of the truly names in economics. I think Kenneth Arrow was there and a few others. And can you talk a little bit about and you guys, they were physicists, wasn't it? Just a combination of economists and physicists or related?
That's
talk
right.
Talk a little bit about that. Call it a debate,
Yeah.
but certainly a discussion.
Yeah, this was in the early days of the Santa Fe Institute when they had just gotten their building in Santa Fe. The building they had with their first headquarters had been a convent. And so literally the president's office was in where the head nun had been, and the conference was held in the chapel. The altar got moved aside and a lectern was put up there. And so it's quite a setting. Ken Arrow, who, one of the leading economists of his day, and Phil Anderson, who was a physicist, also one of the greatest theoretical physicists of the 20th century, got together and had a meeting where there were 10 people on Phil's team and 10 people on Ken's team, and the economists taught us economics over the course of 2 weeks, and we spent a lot of time arguing about how to do it. I think originally they thought we were going to help them solve their math problems, but we really felt like the foundations were not what we thought they should be, and that's what we spent most of the time debating. The person who really stands out to me from that meeting is I've already mentioned several, but Larry Summers was there, and Larry Summers, he's a big figure. He was an extremely sharp guy, and we got in some great arguments at the time. I'm happy to say that Larry Summers is one of the people who has actually put an endorsement on the back of my book. I'm very proud of that because I think he's a good economist, but he was willing to buck the tide a bit relative to his colleagues and say, I actually think these are ideas we should pursue.
Right. So coming out of that, you're 18, you're unimpressed with economics. You come back, you spend 2 weeks with, at the time, some of the premier economists. I mean, Ken Arrow is a Nobel Prize, really the foundation of mathematical equilibrium. And you guys get together and you guys are unimpressed with the assumptions, unimpressed with the outcomes, and very skeptical that their predictions even come close to reality. I mean, it's, if they did, as you say in the book, if Milton Friedman's As If, if the models did a great job of predicting, even though the assumptions were terrible, you would probably be fine. But you have this combination where the assumptions are bad, the math doesn't, it makes sense mathematically, doesn't make sense socially, and the outcomes are wrong. And yet they feel very threatened when you challenge them on all of that. But that obviously is an impetus to see if you can use these new tools of complexity, adaptive agent, chaotic behavior to see if you can model the economy better. Is that a kind of where that heads?
Yes, that's right. And let me just say, I don't want to say, not everything in economics is wrong. There are plenty of things in economics that are right, but the thing we focused on most of the time was actually the rationality assumption, which has since been strongly questioned within the field, and there's a whole school of economics and behavioral economics questioning that and trying to find a suitable replacement. We felt that what's now called complexity economics, which at that point was really just an idea, we thought it would be a much better line of attack, a much better way to incorporate behavioral assumptions into economics. And the key difference is using simulation and not assuming optimality, not assuming that economic agents manage to solve the problem of optimizing their utility. So those were the key things that we challenged, and that I stress in my book, and that the models we're making don't have those assumptions in them.
Let's go back a sentence. Certainly at the time you were doing this, Rational Expectations was leading. I think it's Sargent goes on to get the Nobel Prize for his work in that. At the same time, behavioral economics bubbles up, and we both have Schiller and Thaler go on to get Nobel Prizes in economics, which much to the chagrin of the Chicago School. But I think using your tools, the problem with behavioral economics as it is today is that the pieces make sense. We can model individuals, but when they try to scale it up, there is a different collective behavior that I think you're trying to capture that they've not been able to capture. And I think that's one of the things that certainly there was this big rush into behavioral economics. We learned a lot, maybe too much, but it didn't scale. It was a micro behavior that made sense, but the macro behavior predicted by the micro behavior didn't map. And I think that's what, my opinion, that's what created this opportunity for this complexity. All right, so if we put the pieces together, you're starting to bring complex systems to economics. We're going to reduce the assumption that everybody's optimizing for utility or something like that. We're not going to force equilibrium at the end. And you start to simulate the models. What happens? What do you get?
Well, you get very different kinds of models that can do different things. In an agent-based model of the economy, as we call it, an agent-based model because the essential building blocks for simulator agents who make decisions. And so we try and use behavioral economics to say, how do they make those decisions? Because in reality, we don't do typically complex calculations to make decisions. We use rules of thumb. We maybe think a few steps ahead, use intuition even. And so in our models, the agents who are algorithms that mimic people or other decision makers, information flows in. They use that to make decisions. The decisions alter the state of the economy. That generates new information. More information may also flow in from other sources from outside. And we just repeat that loop and make a dynamical description of the economy. Now, equilibrium may emerge. So it's an emergent behavior if it does, or it may not.
But you're not forcing that constraint.
We're not forcing it. Sometimes we see it. And now, and we think this, at least for many purposes, is a better way to go because we can put in more realism. We can tractably, the problem with this conventional approach is that, or a central problem, is that you have to compute the decisions that will actually allow everybody to maximize their utility, to make their utility as large as it possibly could be. And those kind of calculations are really hard to do. So you write down the equations, you do the math, you use the computer to solve the math even. But once you have more than a few agents in the model, those kind of models get essentially impossible to solve. And whereas we have models where we have millions of agents acting, and those agents can all be different, so we can much more easily capture the richness of the real world and capture the dynamics, and do so with behavioral assumptions that are more grounded in experiment.
And maybe this is obvious, but why now? Why is this now emerging? Is it just because you guys have been pushing, or other things happening to help you solve the problem?
That's a very good point. The idea of doing things this way originally came from Herbert Simon in the early 60s. And Herbert Simon, he's a respected economist. He eventually got the Nobel Prize. But the economics never really took the path that he laid out. There were a few visionaries who tried it, but it's hard. It was hard to do back then. Computers now are 1 billion times more powerful than they were in Herb Simon's day. The data we have is vastly superior because we have the internet to collect it for us and other sources, other digital sources. We've also, some nonconformists have been journeying away, building agent-based models, and we've gotten better at it. We understand more about how to do that. So these forces are coming together now, and the time is ripe, and we're starting to see progress. We've gone in agent-based modeling from having agent-based models be qualitative tools to study a generic economy at some generic point in time to try and make a conceptual point, to being quantitative tools that can study a specific economy at a specific point in time and make quantitative predictions about the future. And so that means the measuring stick has gotten a lot sharper. We're competing head to head now with the standard models that macroeconomists have been building for a long time. And we're starting to do reasonably well with that.
What's been the reaction from the economics world, the traditional world?
Very little. There are some economists like Larry Summers or John Giannakopoulos, Andrew Lowe. There are a few economists who are paying attention and even getting involved. But by and large, I think the rest of the community is just ignoring this. I think, to be honest, I think from their point of view, they've been hearing rumors about this ever since that 1987 meeting in Santa Fe. And they feel like, well, it hasn't delivered yet. Let's just stop paying attention. So I think that may start to change, but, it takes a model to beat a model. I don't think the change is really going to be felt until we can really demonstrate that we can do things better and do them consistently better. I show some examples in the book where we are doing things better, but I think we really have to fill out the depth of our track record so it's very clear cut.
So needless to say, this is not being pioneered by economists. This is being pioneered by other scientists.
Well, there are a few revolutionary economists, radicals. So there are some economists, but also people like me who, I'm coming from physics originally, applied mathematics, people from a variety of different areas. I also have to say that the European economic community is more receptive overall. There are regular conferences in Europe of people who do this kind of thing. No such conference exists in the United States.
You just teed this up and said, when we can start modeling things better than traditional tools, people are going to take notice. Talk a little bit about your modeling the COVID situation in the UK. I think it was UK. And kind of predicted, or the outcomes, or really at the end, how it helped policymakers.
Yeah. So when the COVID pandemic, was on the horizon, I realized, oh my gosh, this is not just going to kill people; it's going to have a big effect on the economy. And so I tapped my kind of dream team of my best students and ex-students and postdocs, and we really started working around the clock to build a better economic model. And literally around the clock, because one of my ex-students was living in Australia at the time. So we'd hand the project to her and she'd hand it back the next day. And so we built a model that's, let me actually say one more thing about that. The other motivation we had is we said, this is the perfect case to show how this works. Why? Because it was clear that COVID was a dynamic, large shock that was going to drive the economy far out of equilibrium. It was going to knock the system way off track. And so it was a good example that should weigh in our favor. It's going to be very dynamic and non-equilibrium. So we built a model that basically was a day-by-day simulation of the economy, sector by sector. We asked the question, can this sector produce its good as it normally would? I mean, we assume the economy would be in a steady state unless something knocked it out of that state. And what would knock it out? Well, if a sector doesn't have a demand for its good, it can't produce it. So airlines never closed down, but there just wasn't much demand because people were nervous about flying. If an economy doesn't have the labor force it needs, it can't produce its good. Well, that labor got hit because people couldn't go to work because they were afraid of dying. And furthermore, if a sector doesn't have the goods it needs to produce the good it makes, if it doesn't have the inputs, it's not going to be able to produce. And any one of those three things could knock it out. So basically what we did is we went through day by day. We loaded up each sector with a typical inventory of its inputs. We managed to boil things down to the inputs that were really essential. If you're making steel, you need iron, you need coke, you need heat, but you don't. Even though if you look in the input table, you have management consultants and restaurants because they have cafeterias. You can get by without those for a few months. So we just went by day and said, does this sector have what it needs to make it? If it didn't, it's going to make less. And if that sector is making less, it may impact other sectors because typical economic sector is providing inputs to other sectors. And so we had a model that we could study what was happening. We predicted the shocks by thinking about, for example, for labor, we had a statistic that said occupation by occupation, how close together do people work? Well, if people in an occupation work more than 2 meters together, they probably aren't going to be able to go to work. And we had a map of which industries utilized which occupations, so which industries were not going to have the labor they needed. And our model produced, well, let me just say what we did. We tested several different scenarios because at the time the UK was in a hard lockdown, but the government had announced we're going to revisit the policy on a certain date and announce something new. And so the question is, what should they do to come out of the lockdown? And we tested several different policies, and we found that the sort of sweet spot, or the least bad, because everything's bad in a pandemic, but the least bad was one where all the upstream industries like forestry, mining, those kind of industries, manufacture, those stay open, but the customer-facing downstream industries were closed. And so we said, this looks good because the economic hit is not as bad as the others. And actually, as far as we can tell from a pandemic point of view, it's also not that much worse than a hard lockdown. And so we communicated this to the UK government. That was a policy they enacted. And the predictions we made turned out to be very good. We predicted, for example, that the economic hit in the second quarter of 2020 was going to be 21.5%. When the dust settled, it was 22.1%. So we got quite close. We did pretty well sector by sector, and we even got the time trajectory of the economic response pretty good. So I think it's a good example where showing that the kind of tools that we're making really can be useful and help us analyze policies and get better guidance.
You know, it's interesting. Certainly, we've always heard in economics prior to this tool is the challenge is we don't get to run an A/B test. We don't get to run let's take this policy, see how it outcomes, and then let's roll back the clock and do another policy. Although with chaotic systems, it may not matter if we roll back the clock. The outcome will be very different. But you're developing a tool that can actually let us simulate close to reality economic policy and having at least a pretty good estimate of the impact of the different policies. It sounds like as your tools get more complex, we can have more complex situations, more complex economies. Is that the goal? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I have to say the pandemic was actually in a sense very simple because this was pretty mechanical. We just had to understand the production function of each sector, and the decisions were made. There wasn't a lot of human decision making there, to be honest. Things get harder when you deal with things like inflation and interest rates and unemployment. Well, actually, excuse me, our model did a good job of predicting unemployment through the pandemic. Because again, the unemployment was forced by the situation. But when human judgment becomes more critical, then things get harder. Now, we have built a macro model that does do the kind of things that the models that the Treasury and the Fed and other economic institutions use day in and day out. And the good news there is we're doing about as well as they do right now. Now, we think we have a lot of latitude to improve, and we're working hard on that. But we think it's a good sign that we got there quite quickly with an effort that's vastly smaller than the effort that's gone into our mainstream competition.
Got it. Got it. All right. I think this is fabulous. I talked to you all afternoon. We're 40 minutes in. I think let's bring David on, and we're going to open up the Q&A to our audience.
Thank you. Good to see you both. To our audience members, now is the time to please enter your questions. We wanted to get your opinion on AI, ChatGPT. What do you feel? Where's it going to be in 5 or 10 years? And how do you feel about the power grid with all this, whether it be electric cars, AI, crypto draining it, thoughts of that nature?
Well, so those are two big questions. I think AI is going to continue to make rapid progress and become more and more interwoven in our lives. I'm not somebody who's terrified about it taking over. I think it does very different things than we do, and doesn't have the drive that we do. Though, we should keep our eyes on the military applications. Now, I want to distinguish what we're doing from AI. I mean, some computer scientists lump agent-based modeling together with AI, or let's say it's in the same basic umbrella. Agent-based modeling allows us to put in a lot of prior information about the economy, and it allows us to ask counterfactual questions. So, in other words, in AI, you can study the world as it is, because all you're really doing is fitting a function to a lot of data. A function just happens to be called a artificial neural net. But you fit a function to the data and you use that to make predictions. But if the world changes, say you change policies and people decide, okay, and now I'm going to behave differently, that may not work very well. Whereas in an agent-based model, we can really think about worlds with different policies. And I think a combination of situations where you have less data and where you need to think counterfactually are the situations where agent-based modeling thrives. Though I'll say we use AI. For example, I have some postdocs at Oxford are working on the question of how can we better mimic the way real people make decisions. You can use AI, ironically, to do that. Now, you also asked me about the power grid. Well, I think you're bringing up the broader question of the green energy transition and the fact that we need to dramatically build up the power grid to use the potential we have there. We want to electrify a lot of the economy. And so we've also done work on that. Our work suggests that the transition is going to happen faster than people think. It's going to make energy prices cheaper than they've ever been. Energy prices are about the same as they were 100 years ago, once you adjust for inflation. If you look at the history of solar energy and wind and lithium batteries and green hydrogen, they suggest that they're all on trajectories that costs are dropping more rapidly than, fossil fuel costs haven't dropped. Nuclear power costs haven't dropped. These renewable technologies are. So I think we're going to see a very different energy system in 20 years. We do have to dramatically build up the grid to get there. I don't know if I answered the question exactly that you were asking, but fire away if I didn't.
No.
I think the two things, AI agents, we've been fearful of technology ever since technology got invented, and it does amazing things for productivity. Some jobs are lost, more jobs are created. That's certainly been the 100-year history of it. And AI feels like it's got a similar, I guess because it's coming after knowledge workers, or maybe some knowledge workers that lose jobs. That's more threatening to knowledge workers than other. But, if you were a laborer a long time ago, those, it's always been the threat. I think that's fair. And then the electric grid, we seem to be able to stay one step ahead of demand. And with a lot of technology, it feels that way. That should continue.
I hope so. I am a little worried about what's sometimes called disorderly transition. Yeah. I think the transition is going to happen quickly, and that also has a danger that it could happen chaotically, in the sense that we want to make sure we keep everything running and we don't strand a ridiculous amount of fossil fuel assets. We are going to have to deal with a lot of stranded labor and stranded assets as this plays out.
Yeah. All right. Your good friend, Robert Hagstrom asks, now that you've succeeded in using agent-based modeling to make accurate economic forecasts, do you believe it will be possible in the near term for agent-based models to accurately forecast the stock market direction?
Well, let me first correct the first statement. I don't think we're making accurate economic forecasts yet. I think we're doing at least as good as the other guys, and in some circumstances we're doing better. But economic forecasting's a pretty hard job. Now I have had a couple of students that have worked on the question of simulating the stock market. My two students, Aymeric Villa and Martin Skoll, have there's something called 13F filings that require mutual funds and some other types of investors to once a quarter report what their holdings are. And we've been analyzing those over the last 3 decades and trying to create a kind of classification scheme for investors based on the data. Some familiar words are value investors, growth funds, momentum traders. And we see those styles in the data, though we don't always see what a fund says it does is actually what it does. But we've created a classification scheme, and we've worked on trying to show the value of what I call market ecology. That is, during my 8 years as a financial trader, what I saw is that in financial markets, you have specialized investors who follow specific types of strategies. And we see, yes, we can classify investors. They do follow specific types of strategies. And we can actually simulate the whole stock market. So Aymeric simulated, 10,000 mutual funds trading 3,000 stocks, where every quarter we can initialize the model based on what we see in the 13F filings, and then iterate forward based on the typical kinds of strategies these investors see. And well, I wouldn't say we're making accurate predictions, but there seems to be something there. And so it's very interesting. I think there's a lot more to do. I'm particularly interested in this, actually, not to beat the stock market. I've been there and done that. I'm interested in using it as a regulatory tool. I'd like to make a kind of laboratory where some new thing comes along, like, oh, look, there are these things called mortgage-backed securities. Let's see what happens when we actually start using them more realistically. And maybe we can avoid things like what happened in 2008, because a lot of the past crashes are really driven by the instruments that we introduce into the stock market and we don't understand. The crash of 1987 was significantly about program trading and its interaction with index arbitrage. And it interacted in a way that people hadn't quite thought, and at least was a major contributor to that big crash. So I'd like to create a lab where we can test these things before we actually use them in real time and lose billions of dollars as a result.
So Robert,
or trillions.
the answer is you're going to have to wait a little while to get
I think that's right.
your prediction.
Though, let me just say there are some tantalizing results on that horizon.
That's good. Diego Gedge has many questions. First, the compliment that he loves you, your epic Gandalf beard, etc. So, but I'm going to try and distill a very lengthy piece here. First is, he says he likes reading The Predictors by Thomas Bass and the Udemic Pie. How would you build a better community to get the incentives right? Have you ever thought about that? So everyone is paid out of future earnings, equity essential. How would you set such a type of community up? And then he also would like to know any advice for his university card counting team that wants to replicate your roulette device.
Well, I don't think I can answer most of those questions. I appreciate it. I'm sure Thomas Bass will very much appreciate the shout out for his 2 books. Um, I do think we can use these tools because we can put in more realistic behavior roles. We can think about how can we set up the rules of the game to incentivize the right kinds of behavior. And so I do think that is one of the great promise of these kind of models. We're building, for example, we're in the process of building an agent-based model of energy investment. We're building on data sets that are available today of which companies own which energy generation plants. We know we have a record over the last 30 years of which companies owned which oil fields and which solar farms and so on. And so we can use that to actually calibrate a model where we simulate the choices of energy companies, which depend on technological progress, which we've made models of. As I said, I think renewables are getting cheaper all the time, and that's going to be a big force in the future. And we can put them into regulatory frameworks for each country, and then look at how those regulatory frameworks influence the decisions that companies make and the pace at which the energy system is changing, and how can we get to net zero faster on a smoother trajectory at the lowest possible cost. And so I think that's a good example of how we can incentivize the right kind of behavior. We can understand how do we change the rules to get to people to behave in a way that gives us prosperity in a clean way, a sustainable way.
And I don't suppose you have anything for the card counting team.
Well, no, to be honest, I never learned to count cards. Roulette was a physics game rather than a math game.
All right, we have one from Kamyar. This is an interesting one. You partially answered it a little bit in the last answer, but there was a comparison between behavioral science and complexity science earlier in the talk. I think both address the issue with mainstream economics and finance, but failed to produce tools that are simple and practical. What is holding back complexity science to be used more in practice?
Yeah, well, I think this is echoing some things we've said already. It takes a model to beat a model. And so we're trying to build models of the economy that can be used day in and day out, that could be used by central banks and treasury departments. And we're making some headway there. We built an agent-based model of housing markets that's now used by a variant on it is used by about 8 central banks around the world. An agent-based macro model is now being used at the Bank of Canada alongside the more mainstream models. The Bank of Italy is busy building one. We're getting a lot of interest from the Bank of England. Actually, we have a call with them tomorrow to talk about that. But we have to get these tools out there so there are options that are easy to use and, do the hard work to bring them up to speed so that they're on a par with the standard models first, and then ideally do even better down the line.
Okay, Vladimir Augustin, I'm going to go a little slow to make sure I get this. There's a growing trend of large enterprises being influenced by input from traditionally relatively passive stakeholders such as non-union employees and customers, amongst others. Much of this is facilitated by low-cost broadcast media. This goes beyond traditional U.S. corporate boards and the primacy of stockholders. So what does or would complexity economics say about direct participation of broad groups of agents individually and collectively in corporate environments? Can it give us insights into the long-term sustainability and potential outcomes of such a trend?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. That's one I haven't been hit with before, but I think it could. I don't think it's easy. I have had some students that have modeled, it's related to the question, opinion dynamics. There's a lot of evidence that people have built models for how we actually change our minds. When do we change our minds? Well, if if two people have a conversation and their views are sufficiently close together, it's well documented that they tend to move closer together as a result of the conversation. If they're too far apart to start with, there's typically very little progress. And so you can use simple rules like this to model how people change their minds. And so some of my students have actually used that to understand what's going on in forums like Reddit, where people, are in chat rooms and they can exchange ideas about stocks, or looking at Twitter feeds, conversations about topics like climate change, to see whether we can actually predict something about, how did we get in this polarized world we're in now? That's actually a typical outcome in these kind of models. You end up with one group that believes black and the other believes white. And how do you coax everybody to come to some grayer consensus? And so those models give us some insight about that. Now, that could be used to think about the kinds of questions that I think that questioner was posing. But it's not easy, and it would be a big job. Requires collecting a lot of data and going in new directions that haven't really been explored very well yet.
Doan, another question, which I think is going to force you to kind of think about model behaviors and new models. Do you think that local decentralized economies will put into practice using programmable money, new digital money, digital currencies? Are central banks at a point where they can consider how these new systems can and will impact the global economy?
Yeah, central banks are worrying about that. I mean, I've had several conversations with people at the Bank of England. They've thought about, I think many central banks are contemplating introducing a digital central bank-backed currency. And I do think that the kind of tools we're building can really be helpful in thinking about those questions. One of the advantages of digital currencies is the money supply becomes very concrete and measurable, though they've had a lot of problems keeping the money supply in any kind of constant state where it's not causing wild crashes and booms. But
it sounds like that's something you potentially can start to build an agent-based model to look at different scenarios and different assumptions on diffusion, adoption, velocity, sources of liquidity, and things like that. That's pretty cool.
We've had conversations with the Bank of England about that, and I think others are seriously. There may even be projects underway that I don't know about that are modeling that as we speak.
What's the question as we come to the end we should have asked you that we haven't asked you?
Wow. Well, there were a lot of good questions, frankly. Nothing leaps to mind.
No, you should answer, where can we buy the book?
Well, it's available on many different outlets, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, maybe even in your local bookstore.
And you're offered a digital copy if you're on the call. You'll get details after the seminar.
So I want to thank both of you for a very engaging and interesting conversation today. We're back in a couple of weeks on November 7th with Paulina Bren on She-Wolves about Women of Wall Street. And I did want to also point out the museum has its annual walking tour of the Great Crash. This will take place on Saturday from 1 to 4. You need to go onto our website to purchase a ticket. It's in downtown New York. We're up upon the 95th anniversary of the Great Crash. So please check that out, www.moaf.org. Thank you again for participating today, all of us, and we'll see you hopefully in a couple of weeks.